Hello, we're doing a book review, and the book we want to review is Batman Year One. Now, Year One is a graphic novel written by Frank Miller and illustrated by David Mazzucchelli. Is that how you say his name?
I think so.
This features the character of Batman, who was originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and it was originally published as a 4-issue comic book series between the years 1986 and 1987, and later on all 4 issues were collected into one graphic novel or trade paperback. Now, Frank Miller, prior to this, essentially completely reinvented the character of Batman with The Dark Knight Returns, which is one of my favorite, not just Batman graphic novels, but it's one of my favorite graphic novels in general. Now, I actually did review this back in 2014 because I do these Batman reviews every year, and I decided to leave my old review up. However, it's no longer public, but you could still see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2014 review of this book. Basically what this is it's a retelling of Batman's origin, and for the longest time, I think this was considered to be the definitive origin story for Batman. So, what do you think of Year One?
I love it. It's just a fantastic origin story for Batman, and, it's essentially just, a story about 2 men who just want to make a difference in this crime, corruption-ridden city.
Basically, it's a cesspool of a city.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so bad that almost every cop is a scumbag.
Basically, the plot of Year One is, as we said, it's a retelling of Batman's origin, but it also explains the origin of Jim Gordon, who would later become the commissioner of Gotham City, the police commissioner, I mean. Basically, in the story, Jim Gordon, he first moves to Gotham City with his pregnant wife, Barbara. Meanwhile, billionaire Bruce Wayne also returns to Gotham City, and you realize that he lost his parents when he was a child, and basically in the story you see Bruce Wayne start to become a vigilante, and eventually he takes on the role of Batman. Meanwhile, Jim Gordon has to take on corruption in the police department, as well as take on a crime lord. Basically in the story you see both Batman and Jim Gordon have to take on a crime lord named Carmine Falcone.
Not only Carmine Falcone, but also Commissioner Loeb and Detective Flass. They're both complete pieces of shit. They're scumbags. And also the Brandon, who was the head of the SWAT team, who was just a complete loose cannon. He didn't care about who he hurt or blowing up whatever buildings,
Mm-hmm. I am going to admit this. I do think this comic is slightly overrated. I like it, but I don't love it. At least not as much as The Dark Knight Returns, which we mentioned before. I don't know, it's a good comic, but I'm just not, in love with it the way other people are.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but I do have a lot of respect for it. Yeah, I would definitely rank The Dark Knight Returns higher than this.
What I do appreciate about this is it really is a crime drama that just happens to be about Batman. It really does read like a dark crime story, and it feels very grounded, even though they do mention Superman at a few points in the comic. I also liked how, really, this is a Jim Gordon story.
Yeah.
Ultimately, this comic, I would argue it's more about Jim Gordon than it is about Batman.
You definitely could make that argument. And I just love how you hear both the inner thoughts of Batman and of Jim Gordon. I mean, it's just, I love seeing how they think about each situation and, what they make of it and the people around them. I also like that this version of Jim Gordon, he's no wuss. He can stand up for himself. He fights, and Detective Flass, has those other guys beat him up.
Oh yeah, Flass gets a really good comeuppance.
Oh yeah. Love when Gordon gets his revenge on Flass, and he knows he's going to beat him, so he even throws him a bat and just says, I think I owe him a handicap. And then he leaves, he takes all his clothes off, leaves him handcuffed naked, and he's not going to admit that I beat the shit out of him because that would be too embarrassing.
But I also liked how Jim Gordon, even though he is, I would say, the true protagonist of this comic, he is a deeply flawed protagonist. He cheats on his wife, and, he's not a perfect guy.
No, he isn't.
And I like that. It also shows, like, in the parts that are focused on Bruce Wayne becoming Batman, there are points where he screws up and screws up loyally, you know?
Yeah.
Like, it shows the beginning of both these characters in a really clever and brilliant way. Another thing I liked about this is throughout a lot of it, Jim Gordon is actually going after Batman because Batman is a vigilante. Keep in mind that this story is supposed to be taking place before they would actually become allies. Also, Harvey Dent is a minor character in the comic. Keep in mind that the story is taking place before he would become Two-Face, and I thought it was really interesting how you find out that Harvey Dent and Batman are secretly working with each other. I also thought it was interesting how in the comic, Harvey Dent is Batman's ally before Jim Gordon, yet Harvey Dent would go on to become one of Batman's greatest enemies. And this also reintroduces Catwoman's origin.
Yes.
In this one, Selina Kyle is a prostitute, which I'm a little iffy on Selina Kyle being a prostitute. I don't know how you feel about that.
I mean, I guess it worked for this kind of gritty origin story.
It's a very Frank Miller thing, I feel like, to make Catwoman or Selina Kyle a prostitute.
You know, Frank Miller, he's a great writer, and he's one I deeply respect. I've met him and gotten autographs from him, and, you know, he's awesome, I would say. I mean, I love The Dark Knight Returns, especially. He brings Batman into the real world. You know, he makes him, you know, he shows him warts and all. Shows the nitty-gritty of it.
And I gotta say, David Mazzucchelli, again, I'm not really sure if I'm saying his name right, but his artwork in this is amazing. It's simple, but also very detailed as well, and realistic at the same time, kind of cartoonish.
Now, this comic, along with Dark Knight Returns before it, had a huge influence on other Batman comics and other Batman media. The character of Carmine Falcone would become a villain in some other Batman comics, most notably The Long Halloween. Like, actually, if you read The Long Halloween right after reading this, that comic does kind of read as sort of a sequel to this in some ways. Both this, The Dark Knight Returns, and to a certain extent Alan Moore's The Killing Joke is kind of what led to the Tim Burton Batman movies for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, I agree.
Also, in Batman Mask of the Phantasm, there are a few flashbacks to when Bruce Wayne was first becoming a vigilante, and you could tell they were definitely taking some elements from year one. I also know that at a certain point, Joel Schumacher actually wanted to do an adaptation of this. I don't know if it was before or after he actually did do his two Batman movies, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, but I know he wanted to adapt this, but I think after Batman and Robin, Warner Brothers was like, you are never touching anything Batman-related again.
No way in hell.
For the longest time, there were talks of doing a live-action adaptation of this that was going to be directed by Darren Aronofsky, who also directed films like Requiem for a Dream and Pi and Black Swan. He wanted to do an adaptation of this, but that never happened. But in 2005, we had Batman Begins, which was heavily inspired by this. Like, Batman Begins is almost a loose adaptation of this to some degree.
Absolutely.
You know, Carmine Falcone's in Batman Begins, and
Batman Begins, and also a lot of it does deal with corruption in the Gotham City police force, and Flass is also a character in it.
And then in 2011, we actually did get an animated film adaptation of this. What do you think of the movie?
It's very good. I enjoy it so much, and the voice cast does a great job. Ben McKenzie voices Bruce Wayne / Batman, and which I found to be very interesting considering he later went on to portray Commissioner James Gordon in Gotham. He does a great job. I actually happened to meet both him and his wife, who was also in Gotham. I met the both of them.
And of course, in the animated film, you have Bryan Cranston playing the voice of Jim Gordon, which I have to say, like, I always felt Bryan Cranston would play a perfect live-action Commissioner Gordon.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a phenomenal actor. I mean, I've seen him in a lot of stuff. And I met him when he was on Broadway in the show All the Way. And I remember telling him, oh, I hated how they killed you off in Godzilla. And he just goes, shh, because the movie at that time had just been released and he didn't want me spoiling anything. I sent him the posters for Godzilla, Batman Year One, and he actually signed them and sent them back. It was great.
I liked the movie all right, but my issue with it, again, as I said, I do think the comic, I like it, but I do think it's slightly overhyped. So with the movie, the film is like slavishly devoted to the comic. Like it's almost like a scene for scene, word for word adaptation, and because it's so true to the comic, I actually feel like it's kind of a detriment because it's so similar to the comic that there's almost no point in watching the movie when you could just read the comic. And as we already mentioned the show Gotham, you could tell Gotham took a lot from this comic, especially with the characterization of Jim Gordon. Pretty sure the upcoming The Batman took a lot of inspiration from this comic as well. Real quick, we want to cut to a short review from our friend John.
Batman Year One is my favorite Batman comic book ever of all time / graphic novel. In my opinion, it's one of the best reinventions of Batman's story arc told ever out of all reimaginations of Batman origin story. I love the artwork and the style. The flashback of Bruce's parents' murder done in black and white was like something out of a 1940s film noir. I love how it shows what happened in 1 year of Bruce trying to figure out how can he become a symbol, an icon, put fear in his enemies, and to become a hero to the people of Gotham City. When Bruce Wayne goes out to fight crime his first night before wearing the cape and cowl, we see it does not go well. He gets hurt, a 12-year-old prostitute stabs him. I don't know why. In some ways, this kind of reminded me of Taxi Driver to some degree. The one thing I can agree with Batman fans, Year One is definitely a Commissioner Gordon storyline. I like how Jim Gordon is new in Gotham and does not feel like he belongs or fits in, which is something we can all relate to. Detective Flash was such a jerk. Flash got what he deserved from Jim Gordon. We see how Gordon is married and has a baby on the way. He's scared and worried about bringing a child into a world that is dangerous, especially how Gotham City is a scary place. This is definitely a semi-prequel to Commissioner Gordon to some degree. It was also interesting how before Batman and Jim Gordon became friends, Batman trusted Harvey Dent and kept Batman a secret. In the original comic books, Gordon was a friend of Batman and trusted him from the start. You never would have thought of Batman have trust or go to Harvey Dent first. It was also interesting in interpretation seeing how Catwoman was a prostitute before she became a cat burglar. In the original comic books, she was just a cat burglar, not a prostitute. Frank Miller is one of my favorite comic book writers. His work on Daredevil, in my opinion, was some of the best Daredevil comic books I ever read. That was the first comic books I ever read of his before I read his Batman comic book, Sin City, and also The Dark Knight Returns. As a kid watching the Nolan Dark Knight trilogy and reading the comic books in recent years of Batman comic books, it has occurred to me that as an adult now, seeing the connection where Christopher Nolan got his inspirations for his Batman movies. In Batman Begins, you can tell that Year One was an inspiration for that movie. Also, you can point out in the Mask of the Phantasm animated film, the part when he's vulnerable against the police, that also came from this comic book when you think about it. I know there were 2 sequels to this comic book, and I've never read any of those sequels, and I'm honestly not sure how those comic books were compared to this comic. And you can only imagine that they probably did not top Year One, and especially how Frank Miller had no involvement with those. The Long Halloween comic was probably the true dedicated sequel to this comic book compared to the other previous 2 outside of the Frank Miller Year One comic. The 2011 animated film was awesome. This was one of my favorite DC animated movies. I love Bryan Cranston's performance as Commissioner Gordon. Ben McKenzie also did a good job and was a good voice actor to voice Bruce and Batman. One of my favorite Batman voice actors. It's also ironic and funny that he played Jim Gordon on the TV show Gotham. Elijah Dushku, who played Faith on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, nailed it as Catwoman. I could actually see her play Catwoman in a real-life action movie. Thank you, Christian, for asking my thoughts and opinion on Batman Year One. I hope you all liked and enjoyed it. Honest thoughts on the Year One comic of Batman. See you next time.
So we hope you enjoyed that. That was our review on Frank Miller's Batman Year One, and bye.